Knapp. I'm the political director with the Libertarian Party of Michigan. I'm excited to have you all here this evening to hear from Mr. Joseph Solis-Mullen. Take your seats and we'll get him up here on the stage. Everyone give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Trevor. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. Well, there we go. I'm just going to turn this slightly. Good evening, everyone. My name is Joseph Solis-Mullen. I'm a professor of history, research fellow, political scientist, economist, and I'm running for Senate on the Libertarian Party ticket here in Michigan. I'd like to just start out by thanking all of you for having me. Thank you to Andrew, to Trevor, to Larry, to everyone whose efforts went into making this evening possible. And thank you all to all of you who are here now, as well as those of you who will be watching later. It was recommended to me by a colleague when I started doing this some time ago that I always begin with something humorous in the spirit of a joke. So here it goes. The Israel lobby has absolutely no influence on American politics. Okay, that done with. Given the date, September 12th, the subject of my speech, U.S. policy toward Israel and the Israel lobby's influence on American foreign policy, in the audience here in Dearborn, Michigan, it was further recommended to me by a different colleague that I share with you a famous letter written 24 years ago almost exactly by the Libertarian Party's candidate for president at that time, Harry Brown. Because I understand that many are only minimally familiar with our party. And so it seems important to make the point that opposition to U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has been the position of our party, our movement, for decades. So while Republicans and Democrats, including the future presidents Joe Biden and Donald Trump, couldn't get out fast enough or angrily enough just how much vengeance they were going to wreak around the world, and especially in the Middle East, in the wake of what happened in New York on September 11, 2001, Harry Brown had this to say, writing in an open letter, quote, "The terrorist attacks against America comprise a horrible tragedy, but they shouldn't be a surprise. It is well known that in war the first casualty is truth, that during any war, truth is forsaken for propaganda. But sanity was a prior casualty. It was the loss of sanity that led to war in the first place. Our foreign policy has been insane for decades. It was only a matter of time until Americans would have to suffer personally for it. It was a terrible tragedy of life that the innocent so often have to suffer for the sins of the guilty. When will we learn that we can't allow our politicians to bully the world without someone eventually bullying us back? President Bush has authorized continued bombing of innocent people in Iraq. President Clinton bombed innocent people in the Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Serbia. President Bush Sr. invaded Iraq and Panama. President Reagan bombed innocent people in Libya and invaded Grenada, and on it goes. Did we think the people who lost their families and friends and property and all that destruction would love America for what happened? When will we learn that violence always begets violence? Supposedly, Reagan bombed Libya to teach Muammar Gaddafi a lesson about terrorism, but shortly thereafter a Pan Am plane was destroyed over Lockerbie, Scotland, and our government is convinced it was Libyans who did it. When will we learn that, quote, teaching someone a lesson never teaches anything but resentment, that it only inspires the recipient to greater acts of defiance? How many times on Tuesday, September the 11th, did we hear someone describe the terrorist attacks as, quote, cowardly acts? But as misguided and despicable as they were anything but cowardly. The people who committed them knowingly gave their lives for whatever stupid beliefs they held. But what about the American presidents who order bombings of innocent people while the president remains completely insulated from any danger? What would you call their acts? When will we learn that forsaking truth and reason in the heat of battle almost always assures that we will lose that battle? And now, as sure as night follows day, we will be told that we must give up more of our freedoms to avenge what never should have happened in the first place. When will we learn that it makes no sense to give up our freedoms in the name of freedom? What should be done? First of all, stop the hysteria. Stand back and ask how this could have happened. Ask how a prosperous country isolated by two oceans could have so embroiled itself in other people's business that someone would want to do us harm. Even sitting in the middle of Europe, Switzerland isn't beset by terrorist attacks because the Swiss mind their own business. Second, resolve that we won't let our leaders use this occasion to commit their own acts of terrorism against more innocent people, foreign and domestic, that will inspire more terrorist attacks in the future. Third, find a way with enforceable constitutional limits to prevent our leaders from ever again provoking this kind of danger against America again. There are those who will say that this is all unpatriotic, un-American, that this is not the time to question our country or our leaders. When will we learn, though, that without freedom and sanity there is no reason to be patriotic? End quote. Imagine, if you will, if you can, a world in which someone like Harry Brown had been president on September 11th. How many innocent lives would have been saved? Estimates vary, but it is conservatively thought that over 4 million people died as a result of the wars Washington launched following September 11th, with many more tens of millions displaced and impoverished, destroying Iraq, later giving rise to ISIS in the aftermath, causing humanitarian disasters following interventions in Libya and Syria, Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, and the list goes on and on. None of that would ever have happened had people like us, libertarians, been in charge, because our policy is, has been, and will remain one of non-intervention in the affairs of other states. Advice that, had it been followed in the first place, would have prevented the events of 9/11 or anything like it ever having happened in the first place. One of my first profound moments of political awakening came in 2008 as a freshman in college, listening to the South Carolina GOP presidential debate, in which then Congressman from Texas, Ron Paul, and the former mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani, got into a rather heated exchange over the causes of 9/11. The latter insisted Congressman Paul apologize for having suggested that Washington's prior interventions in the Middle East had provoked the September 11th attacks, that they were a form of what the CIA calls blowback. Rather than apologize, Paul insisted the audience think it through. Had we really been attacked because we were rich and free? Did that even make sense? Wasn't it more plausible that we had been attacked like the terrorists themselves had said because of Washington's Middle East policies, specifically support for Israeli atrocities against the Palestinians? Before I dive properly into the specific topic of my speech tonight, that is the history of Washington's support for Israel and its policies, and specifically its policies toward the Palestinians, a word on the banality of evil. It was a few years ago now. Wolf Blitzer on CNN was interviewing Rand Paul, senator and son of the good doctor and former congressman from Texas, Ron Paul, about the need to support the Saudi war against Yemen, which had killed 100,000-odd civilians at that point. Demanding Paul answer for his opposition to continued U.S. support for the war, he asked, didn't Paul understand that those weapons that were being ordered by the Saudis from America provided good manufacturing jobs here in the United States? The CNN host was incredulous that Paul could object on moral grounds to what was so clearly a good trade-off. In the mind of the average Republican and Democratic politician in Washington, helping kill innumerable nameless brown people a world away in the name of American manufacturing jobs is a no-brainer. So much so that objecting to it makes you an object of absurd derision, like someone who mistakenly believes up to be down. The normalization of this logic leads inexorably to a society where the performance of evil, taking a hand in killing people for money, has indeed become every day. Having then, I believe, fairly established my position as a skeptic of the current U.S.-Israel relationship, I'd like to move now to a history of Washington's support for Israel and its policies, why it is bad for Americans, why it's bad for Palestinians, and why it is actually bad for Israel as well. While necessarily incomplete, here's some of the relevant history that voters ought to consider. Even before Harry Truman advocated for the creation of the State of Israel in the aftermath of World War II, there was a history of support in the United States and Washington for Jewish causes and eventually for Zionism specifically. In the 1870s, for example, President Ulysses S. Grant issued a stern note to the Tsar's government in St. Petersburg over its alleged mistreatment of American Jews who were there visiting. And more seriously, following the 1903 Kishinev pogrom in the Russian Empire, it led ultimately to the abrogation of an 80-year-old commercial treaty between the two by Washington. With regard to eventual support for Zionism among the American public and in official Washington, its roots can be traced back to the Second Great Awakening and the Christian Zionist movement, whose revivalist preachers taught that the return of the Jews to the Holy Land was the necessary precursor to Christ's own return. And this culminated in 1891 with one of the most prominent of these Christian Zionists, the preacher William Blackstone, organizing a massive petition to the United States government in support of the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The growth of American Zionist organizations in subsequent decades, both Jewish and Gentile alike, as well as prominent advocates like U.S. Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, meant that by the time Truman took office in 1945 and was faced with the question of what to do about the British mandate in Palestine, which was being ravaged by terrorist and paramilitary violence by groups like the Irgun, which was led by later Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, who along with Ariel Sharon founded Netanyahu's Likud party, which, as I say that aloud, makes the brutality of their present actions seem as predictable as tomorrow's weather, but I digress, at least for a moment. The point of all this background is to illustrate that Truman's decision to recognize Israel after its declaration of independence in 1948, while driven by humanitarian concerns over the fate of the Jewish people following the Holocaust, as well as his own personal religious beliefs and sympathies, was driven too by domestic political considerations, because there had existed in the United States for decades strong support for the Jewish people, as well as Zionism more specifically. And whatever else one might say, it is a fact that the UN partition plan would not have passed the narrow vote it did without Washington applying pressure on key holdouts like Haiti, Liberia, and the Philippines. However, it is critical to note that despite the basic unfairness of the division of the land prescribed by the partition, which Truman did support, his administration did attempt to maintain a balance between supporting Israel and not alienating Arab states, particularly due to U.S. oil interests. This attempt at a more neutral stance would continue under the Eisenhower administration. Concerned with the intensifying Cold War and the possibility of driving the secular Arab nationalists fully into the embrace of the USSR, from whose bloc states like Egypt were beginning to buy large quantities of arms. In 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Eisenhower's pressure on Israel, the UK, and France to withdraw from Egypt demonstrated this commitment to maintaining relationships with the Arab states and containing Israel, as did the Eisenhower administration's refusal to approve arms sales to Israel. Although in a sign of things to come, even Eisenhower, whose domestic political figure was virtually immune from attacks by both Republicans and Democrats, had to take to the airwaves to defend himself from criticism in Congress and the press over his lack of support for Israeli actions. Again, this policy was part of a broader approach by Eisenhower and his administration to maintain a balanced stance in the Middle East and avoid inflaming tensions between the Israelis and their neighbors. But it wasn't until the arrival of John F. Kennedy that the U.S. began to provide Israel with significant military aid, marking a significant shift in the U.S.-Israel relationship. It was actually Kennedy who was the first U.S. president to use the phrase special relationship to talk about the U.S. and Israel. And as part of this, he moved toward a more direct military relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv. His administration's decision to sell Hawk anti-aircraft missiles to Israel in 1963 marked the first such U.S. arms deal with Israel. Kennedy's support for Israel was influenced by a combination of domestic political considerations and the strong pro-Israel stance of some of his closest advisors. Firstly, then, Kennedy recognized the importance of the Jewish American vote and political support, particularly in key states with significant Jewish populations. The Jewish community was a vital constituency in places like New York, and Kennedy's administration was keenly aware of the need to secure their support. As such, during his presidential campaign, Kennedy had made commitments to support Israel, and once in office, he worked to fulfill those promises, such as those first sales of heavy weapons to Israel. This move was partly influenced by the desire to maintain the political support, too, of the pro-Israel voters who were starting to back pro-Israel groups, which were organizing, and which I will henceforth simply refer to as the Israel Lobby, this loose coalition of interest groups whose relations would eventually become formalized in the 1970s and 80s. Though still relatively limited compared to later years, by the 1960s, the influence of the Israel Lobby in the United States had grown significantly, becoming a more prominent factor in shaping U.S. policy toward Israel. And the growth was driven by several key organizations and the increasing mobilization of the American Jewish community and Christian Zionists, who had begun to wield greater political power and influence. These groups included the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, which I'll just refer to as AIPAC from here on out, which by the 1960s had already become a powerful lobbying group in Washington, D.C., dedicated to promoting U.S.-Israel relations, specifically by advocating for military aid, diplomatic support, and other forms of assistance to Israel. There was also the Conference of Presidents, which represented a broad spectrum of American Jewish organizations and became a central player in coordinating Jewish-American support for Israel. The Conference of Presidents served as a unified front, amplifying the voice of the Jewish community on issues related to Israel and U.S. foreign policy. And then there was the Jewish Federation System, which played an important role in fundraising and grassroots advocacy for Israel through their extensive networks. Together, these organizations mobilized political support for pro-Israel policies and helped to shape public opinion in favor of a strong U.S.-Israel relationship through a combination of lobbying Congress, organizing events, engaging in media campaigns, and building alliances with other political groups. The Israel lobby was thus able to strengthen the U.S. public and political support for Israel. Indeed, by the 1960s, the combination of lobbying efforts, Cold War context, and domestic political considerations were indeed going to produce this more robust and systematized Israel alliance. A final factor that played into Kennedy's administration, which we'll see later, was that several of Kennedy's closest advisors were known for their strong pro-Israel sympathies. Among them was Meyer Feldman, a close advisor who served as the White House liaison to the American Jewish community. Feldman was instrumental in advocating for increased U.S. support for Israel and played a key role in the decision to approve military aid to the country. There was also Kennedy's Secretary of Labor, Arthur Goldberg, and businessman and donor Abram Feinberg. These also had significant influence and were staunch supporters of Israel and influenced U.S. policy in the region. The latter had actually founded Americans for Haganah. In summary, then, Kennedy's support for Israel can be seen as a blend of pragmatic political maneuvering, the influence of the coalescing Israel lobby, and the influence of key advisors who were personally and ideologically committed to Israel's security and survival. The combination of these factors led to a policy shift that marked the beginning of the close U.S.-Israel relationship that would continue to develop under subsequent administrations. One area support did not extend to was the covert Israeli nuclear program. But though Kennedy was insistent Tel Aviv not go through with nuclearization, it was unwilling to risk an open break at the time of his death, and the inspections to ensure Tel Aviv was complying with Washington's demands to desist were pro forma and ineffective. Such as it was, then, when Johnson came to power, he had no interest whatsoever in challenging Israel in any way on any issue, including over its nuclear program. According to Warren Bass, a historian and Defense Department official, when Johnson was presented later with evidence by the CIA that Israel had indeed gone nuclear and was building weapons, all Johnson said was that the information needed to be buried. Mind you, this was at the same time it was pressuring other countries to sign the Non-Proliferation Agreement. But in this, Johnson was following the general trend in American politics, where in defense circles, Congress, and the press, Israel was beginning to be seen as a strategic asset in the Cold War, especially in countering Soviet influence in the Middle East. It was in this context that Johnson's administration initiated regular military aid to Israel, solidifying the military aspect of the relationship and sending the first such major military aid package in 1968. The backdrop for this was a combination of the Six-Day War in 1967, which saw the Johnson administration and Congress in lockstep over strong support for Israel during the conflict, marking a significant deepening of the relationship, and the increasing strength of the Israel lobby, which worked hard to ensure this vital support in Washington and in the major media, even when it intentionally did things like attack an American ship, the USS Liberty. Indeed, the 1960s marked a period of significant growth in the power and influence of the Israel lobby in the United States, successfully advocating for policies that strengthened U.S. support for Israel. And this growing influence helped solidify the relationship, making it a cornerstone of American foreign policy in the region going forward. In another stark departure from the early post-war Truman and Eisenhower administrations, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, unlike the Suez War, the Johnson administration did not press the Israelis to give up their territorial gains, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai, or come to a sustainable peace agreement with its neighbors, this despite having opposed the preemptive Israeli attack to begin with and the beginning of illegal settlements in the occupied territories thereafter. This policy of increasing support for Israel, despite it behaving contrary to the desires of its superpower benefactor, was carried over by the Nixon administration during the 3-year war of attrition that followed the Six-Day War. This lack of pressure on Tel Aviv was accompanied by increases in military aid, formalized by a 1973 memorandum of understanding whereby Washington committed to selling Israel heavy weapons over the long term. It had, after all, helped destroy secular Arab nationalism, which Washington had come to see as a threat. This policy of strong support for Israel was intended to prompt a reevaluation by the Soviets' Arab client states of the limited value of Moscow's friendship, and to prompt a subsequent realignment of these states toward Washington and Tel Aviv. However, this possibility was limited by a pledge by Washington to Tel Aviv not to engage in any diplomatic overtures to its enemies without previously consulting Israel, which obviously resisted. Indeed, despite what Kissinger described as attempts not to be seen as, quote, overly or overwhelmingly favoring Israel, the Nixon administration's support for Israel during the 1973 October War was so significant as to make the United States the, quote, focal point of Arab resentment. This was probably deserved, for as later declassified U.S. documents show, Kissinger gave the Israelis the green light to violate the Security Council's ceasefire resolution in order to consolidate its gains and thereby strengthen its negotiating position, to say nothing of its increased material and economic support during the war. Despite this and other favors, Kissinger found he had no greater leverage on the Israelis during the ensuing peace negotiations than before. Fuming in a note, I asked Rabin to make concessions, and he says he can't because Israel is weak. So I give him more arms, and he says Israel doesn't need to make concessions because it is strong. The cost to Americans of continuing down this road of support for Israel was to be staggering. For Israel, having encountered early difficulties and apparently running short of necessary military supplies, Nixon ordered a massive airlift of military supplies to Israel, paid for by a $2 billion grant from Congress. Sold as crucial to Israel's survival during the war, by the time the supplies actually began arriving, the tide of the war had already begun turning critically in Israel's favor. But in response to Washington's decision within hours, the oil embargo was announced. Estimates vary, and it is indeed extremely difficult to begin to calculate. But the rise in the cost of oil from around $20 to over $60 a barrel caused prices across the American economy to soar. of the sectors of the American economy the worst hit were its manufacturing industries, and it was during this period that the first great wave of deindustrialization hit what would soon come to be known as the Rust Belt. Unsurprisingly, pro-Israel lobbying efforts in Washington intensified to maintain U.S. support in the face of what had become serious economic repercussions. But there were many inside the Beltway happy to oblige. As Nixon explained in a later interview, these American supporters of the State of Israel, quote, believe that America's survival and security is directly related to Israel's. In other words, that being for Israel first does not mean you are putting America second, because they think the two go together, end quote. Things were only going to get worse in that respect. But first, during the Ford administration, the U.S.-Israel relationship experienced a significant, though temporary, strain due to a policy initiative known as the, quote, reassessment. This period of reassessment began in 1975 following a deadlock in negotiations between Israel and Egypt after the 1973 war. President Ford, along with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, was frustrated by Israel's reluctance to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula as part of a peace agreement with Egypt, which was seeking to move into the U.S. camp. The reassessment itself was essentially a review of U.S. policy towards Israel, with the possibility of adjusting American diplomatic, military, and economic support if Israel remained inflexible in the peace negotiations. As part of this process, then, Ford suspended new arms shipments to Israel, the strategy being to exert pressure on Israel. It was aimed to demonstrate to Israel that U.S. support was not unconditional and that Israel needed to align more closely with American interests, especially regarding the pursuit of peace with its Arab neighbors. However, this attempt at reassessment was met with swift and significant backlash from the U.S. Congress and the Israel lobby. Many members of Congress, influenced by pro-Israel sentiment and lobbying efforts, opposed Ford's approach. And with AIPAC leading the way, the lobby effectively mobilized support within Congress to counter the reassessment. And in May 1975, a letter signed by 76 U.S. senators, just enough to overcome a presidential filibuster, was sent to President Ford, urging him to continue providing strong support for Israel and warning against any actions that might weaken Israel's security. The letter, which you can find by Googling the 76 senators letter, was a clear indication of the political power of the Israel lobby and strong bipartisan support for Israel within Congress. Facing humiliating defeat in the run-up to his own attempt at being elected president, the pressure from Congress and the Israel lobby ultimately led to the collapse of Ford's reassessment policy, and by the summer of '75, Ford and Kissinger had abandoned the reassessment and resumed military aid to Israel. In September, Israel and Egypt signed the Sinai Interim Agreement, which facilitated a partial Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai in terms far more favorable to Israel than what Ford and Kissinger had initially sought. Building on the Sinai Interim Agreement brokered by his predecessor, President Jimmy Carter facilitated the final peace process between Israel and Egypt, culminating in the Camp David Accords in '78 and the subsequent Egypt-Israel Peace Treaty in '79, signed by Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. The accords consisted of two frameworks. The first focused on establishing peace between Egypt and Israel, including the return of the Sinai Peninsula, which Israel had captured during the 1967 Six-Day War, to Egypt. In exchange, Egypt became the first Arab country to officially recognize Israel. The second framework dealt with establishing a self-governing Palestinian authority in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Critically, as part of the peace agreement, the United States guaranteed continued military and economic aid to Israel, as well as begin substantial assistance to Egypt. The U.S. agreed to provide Israel with modern military equipment and technology, ensuring that it maintained its quality military edge in the region. The support was critical in persuading Israel to make territorial concessions, particularly the return of the Sinai Peninsula. In this, again, the Israel lobby played a significant role, as indeed it had played a significant role throughout the peace process, including Washington's veto of a UN Security Council resolution calling for a Palestinian state the following year. Further, while Carter was dedicated to achieving a balanced peace agreement, the lobby ensured that Israel's interests were protected regarding their military aid package guarantees of U.S. support, despite the ramping up of settlements under the new Begin government and his Likud party. The late 70s and early 80s saw a complex and volatile period in the Middle East, marked by growing tension between Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which I'm just going to call the PLO after this. Despite efforts from Washington to establish some form of diplomatic engagement with the PLO, Israeli hardliners, particularly under the leadership of Defense Minister Ariel Sharon, were deeply opposed to such moves. These hardliners believed that any negotiation with the PLO would undermine Israeli security, and they thus sought to create conditions that would force Washington to back away from its attempts at diplomacy and align more fully with Israel's more aggressive stance. The turning point in this effort came with the 1982 Lebanon War. Israel had previously engaged in limited operations in southern Lebanon, a region where the PLO had established a significant presence following their expulsion from Jordan in 1970. The PLO had used southern Lebanon as a base from which to launch attacks on northern Israel, and Sharon's ambitions would extend far beyond merely curbing these attacks. Sharon, who had long been a vocal advocate of a decisive military solution to Israel's security challenges, saw an opportunity in Lebanon. He believed that a large-scale invasion could destroy the PLO's infrastructure in Lebanon and install a government in Beirut that would be more favorable to Israeli interests. In particular, Sharon hoped to align Israel with the Maronite Christian Phalange militia, which had its own interest in driving out the PLO and diminishing the influence of Lebanon's Muslim population. In June 1982, following an assassination attempt on Israel's ambassador in the UK by a Palestinian faction in no way under the control of Arafat, who had recognized that the recent campaign of terrorism directed against Palestinians in Lebanon by Israeli intelligence was meant to provoke just such a response in order to provide the needed pretense for the pre-planned invasion of Lebanon, and was thus trying to restrain hardliners in his own movement, Israel launched what quickly escalated into a full-scale invasion. Advancing all the way to Beirut, laying siege to the city in an attempt to oust Yasser Arafat and the PLO leadership, the invasion resulted in significant civilian casualties and the intensity of bombing, cluster bombs in densely populated areas drew international condemnation. Further, in September of 1982, the Israeli military allowed the Christian Phalange militia to enter the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila in West Beirut, and the Phalangists, with Israeli forces effectively standing by, carried out a massacre of civilians, including women and children, killing many hundreds, if not thousands. For a moment, however brief, the First Lebanon War and these massacres looked like they might strain the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv. After initially supporting Israel, the scale of the destruction in Lebanon and the atrocities committed during the conflict forced the Reagan administration to reassess. A break was not to be, however, for even though Israel had invaded a neighboring country and engaged in atrocities, the U.S. Congress responded by passing an additional $250 million worth of appropriations and supplemental aid for Israel, despite opposition from the White House, and specifically new Secretary of State George P. Shultz, who was irritated by Israel's use of cluster bombs in civilian areas and its role in the multiple massacres conducted by the Lebanese militias. But the appropriations sailed through Congress, leading Shultz to later remark, "I was astonished and disheartened. It brought home to me vividly Israel's leverage on our Congress, and I saw that I must work carefully with the Israelis." Indeed, Reagan's administration marked a deepening of the military and intelligence sharing relationship as well as increased economic and military aid. Thoroughly cowed, it did nothing as the Israelis shot down its preferred peace plans and settlement in the occupied West Bank expanded rapidly. The incoming administration of Reagan's successor and Vice President George H.W. Bush again attempted to push back on this blatant disregard for its patrons' increasing preference for a two-state solution, delaying what had become the pro forma practice of guaranteeing Israeli government loans due to its settlement expansion in the occupied territories, which were understood to be a necessary part of any future Palestinian state. That was in 1991. The same year at the Madrid conference, Washington put pressure on the Israelis to participate in these first direct talks with the Palestinians and their Arab neighbors, including the PLO, which was virtually represented by the Jordanian Palestinian delegation. 2 years later, at Oslo, the first Bush's successor, Bill Clinton, succeeded in getting official recognition of the PLO by Israel and set up a process for Palestinian self-rule. Although the accords did not directly create a Palestinian state, they were seen as a huge stepping stone toward a potential two-state solution. What explained this sudden willingness of the Israelis to compromise, to do as Washington demanded? After all, even when the Bush and Clinton administrations were playing hardball, they still strongly supported Israel overall. But the answer was simple. With the Cold War over, the Israelis couldn't be sure of Washington's continued support and needed, quote, new glue for the alliance. They eventually settled on demonization of Iran, but it would take time for this new policy of, quote, dual containment of Iraq and Iran to become established in the Beltway. To help it along, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin directed the Israel lobby to campaign hard for the new policy, and one of Clinton's key policy advisors, Martin Indyk, who had formerly been an advisor to another Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Shamir, unveiled the policy at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, WINEP, an AIPAC spinoff founded by Indyk himself. As a side note, it is likely that it was Israel turning against Iran in the hopes of creating a new enemy that Washington and Tel Aviv could share that eventually caused Tehran to start supporting Hamas, which it only started doing in 1995. As it happened, in the meantime, the promise of further negotiations with the Palestinians by the Israelis would keep the aid from Washington flowing. Indeed, while the Clinton administration thought it was making progress toward a final settlement at Oslo, it actually increased military and economic aid to Israel, despite the fact that settlement expansion continued during the 1990s, particularly in areas Israel sought to retain in any final agreement. The Israeli government pursued a policy of creating, quote, facts on the ground by expanding existing settlements and establishing new ones, especially around East Jerusalem and in the larger settlement blocks. With the election of George W. Bush, neoconservatives who were Israel's strongest advocates in the Beltway were now inside the White House and Pentagon. The Israelis decided to use the Second Intifada to freeze the peace process by effectively giving Gaza over to Hamas, which quickly gained control of the territory following an attempt by Washington to provoke a coup against Hamas, which led to them seizing control following the elections that had seen them gain a plurality in 2006. So much for democracy promotion. But of course, this was all part of the program for the ascendant Israeli hardliners under Benjamin Netanyahu. As my colleagues at the Libertarian Institute have spent extensive amounts of time and energy chronicling over the years, Hamas was useful for killing the peace process. Picking up from the old Western imperialist playbook, the Israelis would use the violent religious hardliners to undermine the secular Arab nationalists as an excuse to never have to follow through on a separate state for the Palestinians. The so-called Netanyahu doctrine that sought to keep Gaza and the West Bank from the hands of a single authority with whom it would be expected to deal. Netanyahu also helped lie the United States into invading Iraq and has consistently done everything he can to derail attempts at détente between Washington and Tehran, including killing the JCPOA under Trump, but I suppose we can leave those aside for a moment. However, I would be remiss in not taking this moment to point out that at no point in all of this, as I have recounted 6 decades worth of Washington serving the interests of the Israeli state, have the American people ever gotten anything out of it but trouble. Recall again here, on September 12th, that in explaining his reasoning for targeting America on 9/11 in his letter to America, bin Laden explicitly pointed to Washington's unwavering support for Israel despite its treatment of the Palestinians. And then the cost, in financial terms, to the tune of $3 billion a year, not including hidden costs incurred through loan guarantees or upfront borrowing on Israel's behalf, and a host of special privileges, rights, and exemptions that the Israeli government enjoys that no other government on earth receives from the United States. Especially because, to continue on a theme that's been developing throughout this narrative, Tel Aviv just ignores what the White House actually wants. For example, despite George W. Bush being the first U.S. administration to officially endorse the two-state solution in 2002, settlement expansion never ceased, with successive Israeli governments, regardless of political orientation, supporting the growth of settlements in the West Bank, regularly authorizing new construction, and retroactively legalizing outposts that were initially established without government approval, which, because of the opaque nature of U.S. funding to Israel and dollars being fungible, was essentially carried out in part with our money. Under Obama, hope and change were promised, but though his administration did have several public disputes with Israel over settlement expansion and military operations against the Palestinians, military aid and support remained strong, probably because Israel lobby spending virtually doubled with his election, and the simultaneous Supreme Court ruling Citizens United prompted a significant increase in lobbying spending pretty much across the board. And then there was the fact that his administration was essentially staffed by Clintonites who adhered to D.C. orthodoxy regarding support for Israel. However, in a rare show of defiance, trying to prevent the United States being dragged into a war by Israel, which in the early years of his administration was engaged in an incredible assassination campaign inside Iran and around the region, targeting Iranian scientists, Obama ordered his new Secretary of State, John Kerry, to get a nuclear deal done with Iran over Israeli objections. Unsurprisingly, given that the late Zionist megadonor Sheldon Adelson was one of Trump's primary financial backers in 2016, Trump's characterization of the JCPOA as a, quote, bad deal or, quote, the worst deal in history, even though all it entailed was Washington returning the money Jimmy Carter had stolen from them and ceasing to effectively boycott and blockade the country via sanctions, led to him ultimately pulling Washington out of the agreement. This shortly after Adelson had strongly recommended Iran permahawk and Israel booster John Bolton for National Security Advisor, showing Washington's word to be worthless in the process. Of course, Trump also recognized Jerusalem and moved the U.S. Embassy, changes long sought by hardline Israeli nationalists and their American supporters. This while also opening up the American taxpayer's pocketbook to see whether the regimes in Sudan, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia couldn't just be bribed into recognizing Israel despite the Palestinians being permanently denied a state. This is the so-called Abraham Accords. Apart from his own political survival and possibly staying out of a jail cell, one of the reasons Netanyahu is doubtlessly resistant to ending the current war is the promise of support a second Trump administration will bring. Not that Joe Biden wasn't supportive. A lifelong Zionist and supporter of Israel, since 1990, no U.S. politician received more money from AIPAC than Joe Biden. His administration continued military aid and support for Israel, did not rejoin the JCPOA, and did not reverse Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital. It has also supplied over 50,000 tons of weapons to Israel since it began its latest round of war against the Palestinian population following the attack of October 7th, which even the Washington Post was forced to admit had been provoked by aggressive Israeli settlers, the storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the pursuit of the Abraham Accords, which the Biden administration has also continued to pursue. While Kamala Harris has tried to distance herself from Washington's abetment of the Israeli government's killing of 40,000 civilians in Gaza since October of last year, like fellow Democrat and U.S. Senate candidate in Michigan, Alyssa Slotkin, her objections to Israeli behavior amount to nothing but pro forma paeans to, quote, restraint and caution and regret for all the deaths, the bombs they continue to send the Israeli government were causing, never actually condemning what the Israeli government is doing or promising to stop all aid to Israel, but essentially just bemoaning the way Israel goes about doing what it's doing, which makes their job of supporting Israel more difficult because of key domestic political constituencies. Meanwhile, Trump's preferred candidate for Michigan's Senate seat, Republican Mike Rogers, stands, quote, unequivocally with Israel and predictably blames Iran for all the region's troubles. For this, he has received his expected contributions from AIPAC for his Senate campaign. The truth is, there is no daylight between Republicans and Democrats on support for Israel. A few might object on the fringes, but it is exactly that, fringe opposition. And their parties ignore them, and the policy process moves on as though they didn't exist. And then the unlucky ones get targeted for removal come the next cycle. Another truth, despite the fact that like the apartheid regime of South Africa, which could not have survived as long as it did without U.S. support and cover in key international bodies, Israel has been so dependent on the United States. But the government in Tel Aviv has consistently pursued policies that do not benefit the people of the United States, that in fact often fly in the face even of what Washington itself claims to prefer. The fact is, unless voters issue Republicans and Democrats a sharp rebuke at the polls on the basis of its continued support for Israel, nothing is going to change. Israel will continue to be treated as the 51st state. But, of course, as my boss is fond of joking, Israel would never agree to being the 51st state because then they would only get 2 senators instead of 100. So that would be a bad deal for them. But I digress. Bottom line, the Libertarian Party is the only party of actual non-intervention in the affairs of other states. We don't take anyone's side. If this is an issue that matters to you, don't vote for Alyssa Slotkin, who only condescendingly panders to key constituents every few years around election time. And certainly don't vote for Mike Rogers, who would send all our sons and daughters to fight a war on Israel's behalf. Vote in protest of these totally unacceptable options, the literal manifestation of a bipartisan foreign policy that has destroyed the Middle East, ruined millions of lives there, and helped bankrupt our own country fiscally and spiritually. To quote Cassius, "The fault is not in our stars, but with ourselves. It doesn't have to be this way, but if you keep voting for Democrats and Republicans, it assuredly will be." Thank you. I was told to leave time for any questions. That's a really good question. I don't know if the recording picked up the audio or not. The question was whether or not key constituencies here in Michigan, specifically in Dearborn, who are strongly opposed to the Israeli war in Gaza, will either stay at home from the polls or vote for a third party like ourselves, and whether or not this will throw it to Mike Rogers. That's certainly possible. Michigan is obviously one of the few states that's actually competitive. Virtually every state, except for a few that we can list on one hand, are already in the bag. So it's quite possible that will ultimately wind up giving the election to Rogers. It's obviously hard to say. I don't think that the fate of the Palestinians will be any different. I think that whether Slotkin is in the Senate or Rogers is in the Senate, any objection to Israeli policy will again be the kind of, oh, I wish you wouldn't do that, but here's a bunch of bombs anyway. Try and be more careful with this batch. And when the Israelis aren't careful with them, they'll just send them another batch anyway. And, you know, that'll be that. So.
Yes, I have 2 questions. So the first would be, in the 70s,
Couple of good questions here. The first one regards whether or not aid and arms shipments to Israel are actually violations of U.S. law, which I think they probably are. But again, it's how you apply the law. And then the other question is regarding Israel's arming of Azerbaijan, even though it just ethnically cleansed a longtime enclave of Armenians. So I guess I would just take the latter part of it first. I would say that certainly Washington did not try and restrain either of its client states in that conflict. Russia, obviously being very tied down in Ukraine, made it difficult for them to provide their usual support to the Armenians. And yes, Azerbaijan took advantage. The Israelis gave them the weapons. It was a clear-cut case of ethnic cleansing. But I think we all know why the United States didn't condemn it. It's because it was our guys who did it. It's only a crime if someone outside of the American orbit does anything wrong. That's always been true. It's the same reason why any human rights violations in a regime that Washington opposes will receive coverage in the Washington Post, whereas those of subservient client states won't. And I always find it interesting. I think it's informative to read the corporate press, but you have to read it in the way that I imagine Soviet citizens read their official press. You had to look for sort of clues about the appearance of this. What did this mean? And so, like, for example, if you see something, it was several weeks ago now in the New York Times, they had a very small blurb on the second page about Hindu extremists in the north victimizing the Muslim populations there. And if India is not willing to do something that Washington wants, you'll see many more stories like that start appearing. So, for example, if India is not willing to, do more to balance against China, et cetera. With regard to the question of U.S. arms sales being illegal, yes, I mean, under several of its own amendments, it's pretty clear that these weapons are being used in a way that, again, if anyone else did this, using cluster bombs on civilians in a high, I mean, wasn't it, was it a year and a half ago now that we were supposed to all be in great shock and anger that the Russians were using cluster munitions in Ukraine? But, Israel does it, and it's like, well, they're the good guys, because they're on our team. So it's one of the reasons that I think politics is so lamentable in the United States, because it's turned into very much a cartoonish depiction of good and evil, right? Good and evil, instead of just the conflicting interests of states. And again, I think part of this is just the need to stimulate the base. You have to make them feel like these matters and candidates are of extreme urgency and utmost importance, rather than just being essentially slightly different arms of the military-industrial complex and the state bureaucracy. They just want a little more money here instead of a little more money here. It's why whether you have a Republican as the Speaker of the House or a Democrat as Speaker of the House or a Republican president or a Democratic president, spending never goes down and government never gets cut. So.
Could you talk a little bit about neoconservatives and where they came from and what they are? And also, I've heard the term neoliberal. Is neoliberal or is a neoliberal just a neocon?
Well, there was a very interesting consensus that emerged between the neoconservatives and the neoliberals. And the neoconservatives, actually, there's a really great book by Justin Raimondo, Reclaiming the American Right, which he actually writes a whole history of who the neoconservatives are, which they're essentially a bunch of like ex-Democrat Trotskyites who were really tied into the military-industrial complex and who got money from the Israel lobby to write about how America needed to be, a world hegemon superpower. So that book by Justin Raimondo, it's a really great read. I would highly recommend it. The neoliberals, and so the neoconservatives were essentially a brand of conservative who loved militarism and were okay with big government. And on the other side, you had the neoliberals, who were a centrist Democrat who wanted to have fewer unions, cuts to entitlements, and who were very okay with a more aggressive foreign policy. And so they were able to kind of meet in the middle on a lot of these issues. And so that's basically that. That's why the 1990s had that sort of solid center there that carried into the 2000s before the world that they made in the unipolar moment, 1991 to, let's say 2008, when they had the opportunity to make the world the way that they wanted it to be, and it all was terrible and fell apart. You had sort of the fringes of either side sort of clamoring to take control of the parties. Because that sort of bipartisan consensus there on how government was going to run has sort of broken down. So, yeah. Yeah.
So it's no big secret that these people have been killing each other since the beginning of time. This is biblical. These are holy wars. Okay. There is no fixing holy wars. They will go on forever. They will keep going on. They'll continue. What is your take on U.S. involvement? Would you rather just see them get out and let them do what they're going to do to each other, or do you think there should be a plan where the U.S. is involved and try to fix it?
The question is, should the United States pull out of the Middle East, or should it stick around and try and help resolve things? My personal preference is that they leave immediately. Immediately. We should pull everything back to actual America immediately. Israel is not under any danger of being destroyed. Israel is the most powerful military in the region. They have nuclear weapons, tons of biological weapons. Like, Israel is armed to the teeth. They're not going anywhere. Actually, I had the chance to have a conversation with a journalist, an Israeli journalist. He works for one of the major papers there, and he's a progressive. In the minority there, obviously. Wanted a two-state solution, and is very down about the odds of it happening. And he is actually very pessimistic about Israel's chances of survival, not because of its neighbors, but because the Palestinians and an unwillingness to give them their own state. It's like Emerson said about the conquest of Mexico by the United States. It's the arsenic that will kill us. He said that basically this unwillingness to release the Palestinians, to live peaceably with them, to give them their own state, is it basically just going to destroy Israeli society, and ultimately Israel will disintegrate due to internal civil war between factions. Because, for example, there are many hundreds of thousands of settlers who, he said, you couldn't get them out of the West Bank. If the government told them, okay, guys, we're giving that all to the Palestinians now, it's time to pack up and get out of there, they wouldn't leave. They'd fight the IDF, and they're armed to the teeth. There's hundreds of thousands of them, and the IDF might not even fight them. So it's all a huge mess, and they're very pessimistic. And so for myself, I don't think Washington is going to be able to help. I think Washington's attempts at quote-unquote helping have only made it worse. And it's just going to be a process. Israel, as long as it has Washington's backing, it's always going to feel strong enough that it doesn't really have to think seriously about engaging with the Palestinians. Even though in the 1990s, when the pressure was on to get the two-state solution done, and the PLO and the PA, they were cracking down on their own hardliners within their own movement. They were arresting people who wanted to do jihad against the Israelis and stuff. Like, they were trying. It's not, and Netanyahu at the time seized on the attack of two Israelis by a gang of Palestinians to go back on it was called the Y agreements from 97, 98, which Washington had paid them a ton of money to sign anyway, had given them a bunch of money to sign anyway. And who was it at the State Department at the time? Had basically cabled back saying, we think that the Israelis are just using this as an opportunity to go back on what they said they were going to do anyway. And there's always going to be those people in the Israeli government who don't want to give up this land, who would like to have Gaza because it's great Mediterranean beachfront property. But, the U.S. should definitely not be involved, should not be supporting Israel, should not be involved in the Middle East at all, because the Middle East is very far away from the United States, which is all we should actually be concerned about.
So to piggyback on your question, you could go as far back as the Byzantine Empire. Do you think a two-state solution is even possible, or is it palatable to either side, or has the relationship soured
so much, and the boogeyman of the other side is so politically expedient for both sides that a two-state solution is actually not possible in the current situation.
Well, I would just say that there are going to be factions within each side. Like there are some Israelis who would like a two-state solution. I met a documentary Israeli filmmaker who wants a one-state solution. And she is admittedly in the real minority there, because most Israelis actually want like an ethno-Jewish state. Like they don't want, the problem is there are too many Palestinians. They don't want that demographic imbalance. So most of the sort of liberal progressive types want a two-state solution. There's been a lot of blood spilled, a lot of bad feelings. I will say that, for long periods, the Israelis and Arabs did live together. Peaceably. They lived much more peaceably in Palestine and in the Middle East under the rule of various Middle Eastern empires than they did in Europe. Europe was the home of anti-Semitism up until really 1946. It was actually the Dreyfus affair in France that actually prompted the Zionists to basically give up, throw their hands in the air in the 1890s and say, we can't live here. If even here in the most quote-unquote enlightened country in Europe, Jews are treated this badly, we have to have our own state. And so when Palestine, was going to be divided up at the end of the war, the Palestinians objected, saying, look, we didn't kill all of the Jews and stuff, and we're just one people. How are we supposed to? We're supposed to give up our land to make up for all the sins of you guys over there, especially because the partition, of course, was not very equitable, right? I mean, it was the majority of the Israelis getting the majority of the good land, and some people from far away, like some people from Sweden and Guatemala, voted and like, sorry, you lose your land now, like. So people who say, well, the Palestinians just weren't willing to listen to the UN. It's like there was no representation of the Arab states in those UN votes. I mean, I think there was one or two who could have participated but chose not to because they felt like their presence would legitimize what was going on there. And even then, it was a very close vote. It was a very close vote. I think 2 votes is all that decided it. And the Philippines, who I mentioned, and Liberia and Haiti all got the screws put to them by the Truman administration. In the case of Liberia, it was Firestone Tires, actually. It was a big Firestone Tire operation there, and they said, we'll pack up, we'll pull out of your country if you don't turn your vote around on this. And the regime understood that losing that source of revenue and jobs for his country was going to mean death to his regime, and so he turned his vote around, and that was that. So no, Washington helped make this problem. It was really the British who made this problem. I mean, the British had cracked down on the Arabs and killed all of this was in the Arab Revolt in 1937, and basically the Jews and the Arabs had been fighting each other as sort of low-level terrorist violence, but then basically they had kind of balanced each other out, and then the British killed and exiled too many of the Arab fighters, and so then the Israelis were basically there alone, and started killing all the British. And then in the aftermath of World War II and stuff, like the British felt like they couldn't really respond to the increasingly pretty horrible terrorism that people like the Irgun were perpetrating. The hotel bombing is the most famous, but they tried to bomb the British Foreign Office in London. They tried to bomb the embassy in Italy. So it was really the Israelis who introduced terrorism to the region, and terrorism is a weapon of the weak. And so it was then taken up eventually by the Arabs once it became clear that the surrounding Arab states were never actually going to be able to get them a state, if that was even what they had wanted to do in the first place. There's some disagreement in the sources that maybe they were just trying to do enough to give themselves political cover for their own populations. That's, of course, one of the big concerns today with countries who don't want to seem too eager to take U.S. money and weapons to sell out the Palestinians because they're worried about alienating their populations. So, there could be a two-state solution if the moderates of both sides were in power, but the problem is, of course, killing and violence begets more violence and resentment, and that does not empower moderates.
It's the Western world completely that is at fault for a two-state solution failure, or both sides?
The hardliners in the Israeli government were what destroyed the two-state solution. The Clinton administration pressed as hard as they could and felt like every time they had an agreement, the Likudists would wiggle away and say, well, we meant this or that. And at one point, Clinton says something like, You guys are basically screwing me over. I'm looking like a false prophet here, like I can't deliver. And of course, this is in the context of the unipolar moment where the United States rules the world, and we're going to arrange things very equitably now. And it had been a priority. It had been a priority going back to Carter. That was part of the deal. That the U.S. was formalizing all these agreements with Israel, giving Israel all this money, even though they weren't, making significant progress toward, the creation of a self-governing Palestinian Authority, weren't stopping the settlements into these occupied areas. They were, invading and occupying parts of their neighbors' countries. These were all things that Washington had opposed because it made relations with the Arab states more difficult, which I think it was Moshe Dayan in the 73 war who later on wrote, I thanked Kissinger for his support, and I said, it's only you who will stand with us. But I knew in the silence after I said it that they would really rather be supporting the Arab states. Well, yeah, because Israel doesn't really have anything of strategic value, whereas the Arab states have everything of strategic value. Like, Israel is not a strategic asset. It's always been a strategic liability. And so you can read all sorts of arguments from Winnep and stuff about how Israel is so critical to American security. It's not. It never has been. The arguments are so weak. They've always been weak. And even if they were strong, we still shouldn't support them because Israel is not the United States. And stealing from our citizens to give what amounts to basically a $500 a year subsidy to every single Israeli in what is, the 25th wealthiest country in the world by per capita GDP? That's crazy. Yeah, so no. I don't know. Obviously, I would support a two-state solution, but it's not really my deal. I'm not a Palestinian or an Israeli. Yeah.
To what degree are the greater Israel and settler movements driving the bus?
To a tremendous degree. That was actually one of the things that really depressed the fellow that I met. He said, the greater Israel people don't even believe in the state of Israel. He said they hate it. They refuse to serve in the military. That was one of the things that recently, if you were following the news, the ultra-Orthodox were going to have to go and join the draft. And there was a total outrage because what they want is not an actual secular state of Israel. They want like a kingdom of Israel, like what's in the Torah. And they want Judea and Samaria. And the thing is they're having tons of kids. Tons and tons of kids, like an average of something like seven kids per family. And they're rapidly outpopulating the more liberal, progressive Israeli population who would like to do a two-state solution. And they are a democracy. They vote. And so if you have more people, you win the argument every time. And so the settler movement and the radical hard edge there is definitely gaining the ascendancy. I mean, just look at the election results. Look who Netanyahu's partners in power are now. I mean, they're even more radical than he has ever been. So, yeah. The question there was what will be the result if Trump wins the presidency for the Middle East? I obviously don't have I don't think I have any particular insights into that other than what I've kind of offered, which is I don't think Washington's policy will change. Israel will continue to do whatever it wants, knowing that Israel is just it's a third rail of American politics. It's like talking about cutting Social Security and Medicare. It's absolutely necessary that we do these things, but it's so politically unpopular to do that you can't say it and still get elected. So for Trump, I think I ran through in the speech like all the things Trump did. Even the Biden administration, who said when Joe Biden was criticizing Trump while Trump was in office the first time, saying, oh, that was a terrible idea. Oh, that was such a dumb decision. Oh, Trump doesn't know what he's doing. But when he got in office, what did he do? Did he reverse all those things? No, he just kept all of Trump's policies and just kept right on going, gave Israel a blank check to do whatever it needed to do. If Trump wins, again, I think the Abraham Accords will continue to inch forward. He and his people have a very good relationship with the Saudis, much better than the Biden administration. So you might see progress there. The attack of October 7th was very much meant by the Palestinians to put their concerns front and center again, because they felt like they were being sort of pushed aside. The Trump administration's attempt to overtly just buy everyone off, which that is what happened to Egypt That is what happened with Egypt. Egypt literally got bought off by the Americans in the 1970s to recognize Israel, and Sadat was murdered for it, actually. But basically, they just dusted off the old playbook and tried it again, and I'm sure we'll see the same thing, just more of the same from Trump. I mean, I don't know that, as far as the Middle East goes, policy will change all that much. It won't be good. It will be bad. Maybe even, I would say, actually, no, I will say this. I think it will be slightly worse under Trump, because Trump will give them 100% of what they want, whereas Harris will only give them like maybe 99%. So I think it will be slightly worse under Trump, but it will be a difference so minute that you would need, a magnifying glass to find it. So, unfortunately. Yeah.
You touched on in your speech mentioning that in the past that Israel intentionally attacked U.S. liberty. Can you speak about that? What happened? What is any information about that?
The attack on the USS Liberty, yes, the Israelis claim that was an accident, even though the ship very clearly had identified itself. Scott Horton actually has a great interview, actually has multiple interviews with surviving crew member of the USS Liberty, actually. Essentially, it was a naval signals collection vessel that was cruising around off the coast in the Mediterranean there in the run-up to the Six-Day War. And they were basically gathering intelligence. And the Israelis attacked the ship. They claimed that they didn't realize it was an American ship. Just looking, and the United States government did not demand a full accounting or explanation of what happened. They just said, "Oh, it was an accident? Okay, sounds good to us." Bear in mind, the wider context of that was that the Israelis were sending very alarmist reports back to Washington and putting it in the press and stuff that the Egyptians are mobilized and we're going to get crushed. They're 1,000,000 feet tall. Walt Rostow was telling Johnson, saying, the Israelis are lying. Like, they're trying to get us to give them more weapons or trying to get us to put pressure on Nasser or something like that. Actually, the Israelis, if there's a war, the Israelis are going to win it in 5 to 8 days. Turned out to be 6 days, but pretty spot on. For a government analysis, that's pretty spot on, you have to say. That's pretty sharp. But so, was it to try and prevent the United States from collecting its own independent data? This is before we have the huge global spy satellite system that we have now, where we're much more reliant on on-the-ground intelligence gathering. But of course, eventually Johnson wound up going along with what Israel wanted to do anyway. Actually, that was one of the first big public relations efforts. Actually, the Israeli embassy organized a letter writing campaign, and AIPAC put some spots in the major papers and stuff, because that's what you do is you give money to organizations like the Hudson Institute or the American Enterprise Institute or the Heritage Foundation, and you don't really have to disclose that money. It's like a black hole where money can go. So you only have to disclose that they gave at least $1 million. For example, you'll see that the Qataris gave $1 million, at least $1 million to the Brookings Institute. But how much more did they actually give? Right? We don't know. We have no idea how much. But you certainly notice they don't criticize their human rights policy at that institution. It's the same deal there. You've got interests who pay you, and then those become things that you don't criticize. And you write policy papers in support of doing things that would be beneficial to the people who are giving you money. I guess it's easy to call it corrupt. I'm sure if you ask these people, they would say that they are doing it because they think it serves the national interest, or that it's morally right to do so. Very few people, I think, deliberately go about doing evil things on purpose. Dick Cheney accepted. Yeah, and John Bolton, a pox on him. But no, so it's a pickle that we're in. Yeah, any other questions?
disregard, or what is the solution for us after the election?
There was a lot of great stuff in there, and I'm going to try and remember and address it all. And if I don't, please let me know, because there was a lot of great stuff in there, including stuff that we can do at the state level. Although a lot of the efforts at the state level are directed the opposite way. So, control the height of the flame. Yes, it was the deliberate policy. I mentioned it in here, the Netanyahu doctrine. The idea was that you can't allow the more reasonable, secular, Arab nationalist, Palestinian authority to control both Gaza and the West Bank, because then you have a unified central political authority that you can reasonably deal with and that the international community expects you to deal with, including in the United States. However, if Gaza is controlled by Hamas, which the United States has on the terrorist list, no one, well, I shouldn't say no one, certainly the countries that actually matter in terms of like UN Security Council resolution votes and stuff matter, they're not going to insist that you partner up and do negotiations with Hamas. And so it became the policy of the Israeli government to prop up Hamas and to use the Qataris to do it. And there was a huge scandal. Scott Horton and Connor Freeman wrote a piece. I think it was at antiwar.com originally, or maybe it was at the Institute. I don't remember now. It was right after October 7th. It was like October 24th it came out. But it was, if you Google control the height of the flame, Scott Horton, something like that, it'll come up, because that was a catchphrase that Netanyahu had used in a previous speech, talking about how, yes, it's a dangerous fire, but fire is dangerous, but we control the height of the flame, meaning that they felt like they could control what was going on in Gaza there. That they had a piece in there about, like, just suitcases full of cash being brought in to Gaza to like give to Hamas. And so it was a scandal, and everyone knew about it in Israel. It's very weird. In Israel, there is actually an incredibly robust criticism of government policy. Nothing is off limits there. It's a very robust debate. It's here in the United States where there's no debate. It's wild. In Israel, everybody and their brother criticizes the government and their policy and has an opinion about what's going on and why, and everyone knows what's going on. It's here in the United States where if you say Netanyahu's Likud government gave money to Hamas through the Qataris to prop them up to keep from having to give a state to the Palestinians, they'd be like, you're crazy. I asked the guy I met this summer, and he said, everybody knows that. Everybody knows that that's what's going on. And it's like, well, in the United States, not so much. Yeah. Oh, wait, so sorry. Yes, what can we do? What can we do when the election is over? Okay, so at the state level, things like divestment movements, like trying to pass laws that say, like, we will not take any goods or anything that are produced from the occupied territories, anything like that. Because what's actually happening is the opposite of that. In places like Florida, Ron DeSantis is pushing to pass laws that make it like a crime, basically, to try and boycott or criticize Israel. And so that's what we need to push back against at the state level. So there are things we can do at the state level.
I was just going to say it's a little tougher to play the anti-Semite card.
Yep. Yes, it is. So, yeah, but of course, people saying that you're anti-Semitic and stuff, like, it's the opposition here is to the policy of a state actor, a state government. Governments are by nature criminal conspiracies that extort their populations and murder people. And we believe that stealing and murder is wrong. It's not the fact that it's the Israelis doing it, everyone's doing it, and we're against all of that, including here in the United States. And so I just think it's being principled. So, anyone else?
Non-Israel related, have you had any contact with the folks organizing the debates?
No. I do not, frankly, expect to be contacted by them. It is a nonpartisan group that is put together by Republicans and Democrats to platform their candidates and, in the words of Noam Chomsky, give the illusion of lively debate within the spectrum of acceptable political opinion. That's what those exist for. We did get an offer to go on a local television station here in a couple weeks. We'll definitely do that. Do our 3 minutes, speak to our platform, represent our issues. But no, other than that, I do not expect any kind of platforming by the establishment. It would be foolish of them to do that. It is wise of them to exclude us. So, yeah. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.